Okay, thank you, everyone. My name is David G. I'm an alcoholic addict, and I'm very, very grateful to be here with you tonight. Thank you so much, Ashley, service, and Dennis T. As always, thank you, brother. Just appreciate you guys so much. And most of all, thank you to all of you that are here. It would be a great meeting with Ashley and Dennis. It would be a great, great meeting now that all of you are here. So we're grateful that you are. First, let me just say this, that I don't claim to be the guru of the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. I don't speak with authority for any fellowship. And anything that I say here tonight that you don't agree with, or if your sponsor tells you something different, I just want you to know that your sponsor's right. You should follow your sponsor. I'm just a drunk and an addict who has found a way to recover through the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous and pass that along to others. And that's been happening for a great long time. So last week we talked about the ism in alcoholism on the title page. We talked about that being the core of all addiction, no matter what it is. We can see as we go through this work that it's the thoughts, it's the beliefs, the attitudes, it's the concepts, it's all of these things that dominate us from the time that we're small until now. And the insanity of all of that is I don't even really know this is happening to me. Now, I'm sure there's something wrong with me. I'm smart enough to know that. But what I don't know is that I suffer from a hopeless state of mind. And we looked at that last week. If alcohol is my problem, the only thing I need to do is not drink alcohol. I should be okay. Drugs, don't use drugs. I should be okay. Sex, lust, overeating, undereating, no matter what it is, if that's the problem, all I need to do is not do that. And there shouldn't be more problem. But for a guy like me, and I'm sure people like you, once we stop doing that thing, other things begin to show up and compete for our recovery. The bad news is over any period of time, those things will win out. And usually it starts with resentments. It starts with fear. It feels disconnect. All these things are going on. And so we looked at some of that last week as we looked at that hopeless state of mind. We're going to continue that tonight. And I believe that is Roman numeral 16. It's XVI in the fourth addiction. And that's where we stopped, is at the bottom paragraph of that page. Now, we've seen where Bill Wilson had went, and his friend, Abby Thatcher, had come to see him. Abby brought him two vital pieces of information to that conversation. One was the obsession to the mind that we all suffer from, that he had learned through going to the Oxford groups, which was a movement of that day. Two was the spiritual experience needed in order to recover from a hopeless state of mind. Now, this had been given to Roland Hazard through Dr. Carl Jung, as we'll see later in the book. He's the man who showed up to help Abby. Abby brings this to Bill, and for the first time, Bill understands exactly what his problem is. He had been helped, it says, by the late William D. Silkworth, who is, it turned out to be an amazing man of God that put into our path here to help us to understand what's wrong with us physically. So Bill having this message, he knows that the only way to keep it is to give it away. So he goes on a business venture. He ends up in Akron, Ohio. He's pacing the floor in the Mayflower Hotel, the history of all of this. And he's afraid that he's going to drink again. And so what happens is he makes some phone calls. He ends up hooking up with this doctor. And we're going to see here tonight, because it starts right here on this bottom paragraph. And then we're going to see how this took place with these two men and where it has evolved to for all of us today. Now, Bill was very amazed to find out that Dr. Bob had already been in the Oxford group. Bob already had been trying to apply a spiritual solution to his problem. Bob knew. The first time I ever went to treatment back in the 90s, I knew that something greater than myself had to be the answer to this. I knew that. Well, this doctor knew that as well, because if you look at the bottom of Roman numeral 16 there, it says this physician, talking about Dr. Bob, had repeatedly tried spiritual means to resolve his alcoholic dilemma, but had failed. Think about that in your life. Let me think about that in my life. How many times have I repeatedly tried spiritual means, the 12 steps, psychiatry, sweat lodges, meetings, all this stuff, all the church, but had failed, the same as Dr. Bob had right here. He says, but when the broker, talking about Bill, gave him Dr. Silkworth's description of alcoholism and its hopelessness, and that's what we will see in the first step, the physician, Dr. Bob, began to pursue the spiritual remedy for his malady with a willingness he had never been able to muster. He sobered never to drink again up to the moment of his death in 1950. We see that as a promise in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. Very important paragraph here, not just because it's talking about Bill and Bob, but if I put this in the first person and I take a look at this with me today, and this is how I sponsor men when I take them through this book. The physician. Now, I don't know who that was in your life, but there was somebody who showed up in your life that brought this message to you. Had repeatedly tried spiritual means to resolve his alcoholic dilemma, but it failed. We've already talked about that. But when the broker gave him silkworth, so somebody, that broker for me came in the form, God put him in the form of a full-blood Choctaw Indian who brought the message of Alcoholics Anonymous to me in the very beginning through this book. So it's the same thing. But one of the things that I see here as I really study this closely, Dr. Bob had not had a first step experience. So what we will see as we move through the book, and if you read very much about Dr. Bob, you're going to see that he struggled and struggled and struggled to get sober. And then even after he got sober, it was a long time before the obsession ever left him. So we see here that he had repeatedly tried spiritual means to resolve his alcoholic dilemma, but it failed. There was no first step. He knew the solution, but he didn't know the problem. He thought the problem was alcohol, same as we do. We think the problem is lust. We think it's sex. We think it's eating, whatever it may be. But we come to learn that when we stop doing that, same as him, that's not the problem. That's not the problem at all. If that's the problem, when we stop that, the problem should be gone. So at the bottom of the sentence there, it says, this seemed to prove that one alcoholic could affect another as no non-alcoholic could. It also indicated that strenuous work, one alcoholic with another, was vital. And that's a key word right there, vital. We know what vital means, to permanent recovery. So if I'm permanently looking to recover here, one of the things that I'm going to have to do is strenuously work with other alcoholics, which I do and have done for a long, long time. I'm not looking just to get sober here. I mean, obviously that has to come. I'm not saying that. But if that's all there is, then all I need to do is stop and I should be okay. That's not the case for me. And I'm sure that's not the case for many of you. So strenuous work, one with another, vital. That's vital to our permanent recovery here. So hence the two men sent to work almost frantically upon alcoholics arriving in the ward of the Akron City Hospital, their very first case of desperate one. I've got a question mark there in my book. Is that me? Was I that desperate one whenever I came into this work? Not only in 94, but in 2019, whenever I hit an emotional bottom in sobriety after 24 years, was I a desperate one? It's hard to work with somebody who isn't, somebody who comes in and they're not really desperate. The gift of desperation is a very good thing here. But look what happened to this man. We're talking about a man by the name of Bill Dotson. This was number 3. And what they'd done was they came and they sit down. They didn't talk about the flash of light experience. They talked about alcoholism and its hopelessness, addiction and its hopelessness. It's the same way that we're going to look in the coming weeks here. It says he recovered immediately. I mean, that's the spiritual experience. That's immediately. The book says some of us grow into it more slowly, but to some it comes immediately. To this man, it came immediately. And in the history books, it says that he asked his wife to get his clothes out of the closet. He was going home. He walked out of the hospital a free man, never to return again, never to drink again, after years and years and years of fighting this. So this worked, and that's what we're going to call this. Moving through the rest of this book, any guy that I work with, that is what we call it, the work. Why? Because that's what the book calls it. The work continued at Akron through the summer of 1935. There were many failures, but there was an occasional heartening success. Charlie always told me, I think we need to give just as much appreciation to the men who failed as we do to the men who succeeded. And the reason is they learned what not to do from those guys. Chuck C., an old-timer in this fellowship, always said, every man is my teacher. Some teach me what to do. Some teach me what not to do. And I find that to be true. We see it here as well. So there were many failures, but there was an occasional heartening success. Think about that in your own life with the people you work with, the people that you sponsored. Every now and again, someone will come along and they'll grab with us and they will go with it. And man, it's a beautiful thing to watch. But most of us have to go through many sponsees before we get to someone like that. So when the broker, we're talking about Bill, returned to New York in the fall of 35, the first AA group had actually been formed, though no one really realized that at the time. A second small group promptly took shape at New York to be followed in 37 with the start of a third at Cleveland. Besides these, there were scattered alcoholics. And I need to look at that and ask myself that question. When I came into this fellowship, was I scattered? Was I everywhere? Was I that way after I'd been here for a little while? I don't know about anybody else, but a lot of this stuff comes to me sober, not just drunk. When I sober up, I'm scattered. So these guys that picked up the basic ideas in Akron or New York who were trying to form other groups in other cities, watch how the hand of God begins to move here. In late 37, the number of members having substantial sobriety time behind them was sufficient to convince the membership that a new light had entered the dark world of the alcoholic or the addict. What a beautiful promise for people like us. I mean, because up until this time, as far back as history ever dated, there had never been a cure for alcoholism as far back as man had been alive. So it seemed that in the history books, it tells us this, that Bill had went on another venture to Akron. He had stopped by to visit with Dr. Bob to see what was going on. They began to count the number of heads that had been really transformed by this message. And I think there was about 40 people at that time who were staying sober. So for the first time, they realized, I think we found the answer to alcoholism. And what a beautiful moment that must have been. So we like to look at this next paragraph as really the first ever group conscience that took place. They called together the people. They put together a hell of a plan. Thank God it didn't take place, because if it had, there probably would be none of us here today. But they decided that they were going to build a chain of hospitals that would stretch all the way across the United States. Of course, Dr. Bob would be the head physician. They would train missionaries. They would do this. Bill Wilson would be, he'd be in the middle of it. And of course, anybody that didn't have money could come in. They could recover here. I mean, it just went on and on and on. There was no guy in that meeting that night from Asylum. It's kind of strange sometimes where you hear God at. And he said, man, I think that's a great idea, but how are we going to pay for this? And so that raised the question. Another thing that was beginning to happen, or that they knew would happen, which has happened in our time, people would begin to take the book. They would begin to take the message. They would either add to it or they would take away from it. And they knew that this thing was going to be watered down, and at some point it was going to be lost. So there was really only one way to preserve it, and that was to put it in a book, put it in written form. Now, in those days, the program and the fellowship was exactly the same. There was no difference. As we're going to see here in just a few minutes, that's why the success rate was so high at that time. But as we read on from here, it says it was now time that the struggling groups thought to place their message and unique experience before the world. This determination bore fruit in the spring of 39 by the publication of, keywords here, this volume. Now, the fellowship's a wonderful thing. I don't dog it. I got to have it. I got to have it. But if I'm dependent on that for my recovery, I'm in bad shape. I'm in bad shape. Sober is not well for a guy like me if I'm sitting there untreated. So in order to put this into this volume and to spread it throughout the world is the greatest thing that they ever did. Thankfully, they didn't build any hospitals and they didn't do any of this stuff. But what they did do was they wrote the book. And so we're going to see where it says the membership had then reached about 100 men and women. Now, the fledgling society, which had been nameless, very important words right here, now began to be called Alcoholics Anonymous from the title of its own book. So had it not been for the book, there would have never been a name to the fellowship. There just wouldn't have been. The fellowship, we read it right there, was nameless. They come up with all of these names for the book. I mean, they had voted on all of this stuff. It was going to be called The Way Out. They found out that 13 other books had already been written called The Way Out. They looked at, one of them was the Bill W. movement. I mean, it just went on and on. And there again, somebody that they never even noticed said, why don't we call it Anonymous Alcoholics or Alcoholics Anonymous or something like that? And that became the name of the book, Alcoholics Anonymous. And what a great book it has been, because the original message has been left in this book. And as we go through these weeks, you will absolutely see how to break it down and recover the same way that the first 100 did. It's no different. So here's where it really begins to take off, because he says the flying blind period ended. When I look at that sentence, I like to personalize that. I want to look at that in my own experience. I was flying blind in the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous and other fellowships for a long time. Now, I'd had a bit of a spiritual awakening. There was no doubt. I had a great spiritual awakening in 95. But there was something that come back to blind me after a period of time. It began to take away my vision. I couldn't really see. And what happened was where the veil had once been lifted, now it had been dropped again. And self had overtook me, and I didn't even know this was happening to me. Now, I knew I was struggling in some areas in my sobriety, but my pride wouldn't let me tell anybody about it. And as a result, I ended up in a whole lot of trouble. So the flying blind period ended. AA entered a new phase of its pioneering time. With the appearance of the new book, keyword, the new book, a great deal began to happen. Now, they had already met. They had come together as a fellowship. But with the appearance of the book, now is when a great deal begins to happen. Dr. Harry Emerson Fosdick, the noted clergyman, reviewed it with approval in the fall of 39. Colton Osler, then editor of Liberty, printed a piece in his magazine called Alcoholics and God. Now watch how the hand of God begins to move here through the book Alcoholics Anonymous. This brought a rush of 800 frantic inquiries into the little New York office, which meanwhile had been established. Now, each inquiry was painstakingly answered. Pamphlets and books were sent out. Businessmen traveling out of existing groups was referred to these prospective newcomers. New groups started up, and it was found to the astonishment of everyone that AA's message could be transmitted in the mail as well as by word of mouth. By the end of 1939, it was estimated that 800 alcoholics were on their way to recovery. What a beautiful, beautiful thing. Just as the result of the publication of this book, 800 people, it went from 2 to 800. Now they've recovered. Let's watch how the hand of God continues to move here. In the spring of 1940, John D. Rockefeller Jr. gave a dinner for many of his friends, which he invited AA members to tell their stories. Now, news of this got on the world wires. Inquiries poured in again, and many people went to the bookstores to get the book, Alcoholics Anonymous. 2 years later, by March of 1941, the membership had shot up to 2,000. We're talking from 800 people to 2,000. That's a 1,200 more had joined, had recovered by getting the book and doing exactly what it said. Then Jack Alexander wrote a feature article in the Saturday Evening Post and placed such a compelling picture before AA that the general public that alcoholics in need of help. I want to look at that as a question for myself. Am I one of those in need of help, whether I've been around here for a long, long time or I'm just now starting the program? Am I in need of help? And if I am, is my pride going to allow me to do that? But look at what happens here. By the close of 1941, the end of that year, AA numbered 8,000 members because of the book, not the fellowship, the book. And that's what we're going to continue to see, the original program, exactly as it's been written whenever we move into the rest of this. So it says, our society then entered a fearsome and exciting adolescent period. The test that it faced was this: could these large numbers of erstwhile erratic alcoholics successfully meet and work together? That's a question that I like to ask even to this day, because you have a lot of personalities that come together. And if all of those haven't had a spiritual experience, which most of these people have, but today they haven't, there's going to be a whole lot of issues, I promise. So would there be quarrels over membership, leadership, and money? That's a question. Is that going on today? Would there be strivings for power and prestige? Oh my God, did I take an emotional beating with that through the Broken Bottle Group in Oklahoma? Would there be schisms that would split AA apart? Soon AA was beset by these very problems on every side and every group. But out of this first frightening and first disrupting experience, the conviction grew. And I think this is probably the most important few words on this page. We AAs had to hang together or die separately. And I think it's that way today. We either hang together or we die separately. So the unity of the group is a very, very important thing. I'm not saying that it's not at all. It says we have to unify our fellowship or we have to pass off the scene. So we're going to look at the traditions and the way that they were outlined in this. And he says, as we discovered the principles by which the individual alcoholic could live, we see now that is the 12 steps, the principles. So we have to involve principles by which the groups in AA as a whole could survive and function effectively. This is the 12 traditions. It was thought that no alcoholic man or woman could be excluded from our society, that our leaders might serve, but never govern. We know, if you're familiar with the traditions, any at all, that's the second tradition. That each group was to be autonomous, and there was to be no professional class of therapy. We see that the autonomous is tradition 4. There was to be no professional class of therapy. We see that's tradition 8. And I want to talk about that for just a second. I don't want to dive into it too much. I think therapy is very good, and it serves a great purpose and helps a whole lot of people. And I do know that if my problem is therapeutic, then therapy is very important for me. It is. But when getting into this and finding out that my problem was spiritual and seeing that I needed spiritual experience in order to recover, once I did that, in my case, I've never had to return to any professional class of therapy ever again. And that's been a beautiful thing. So there was to be none. Why? Because this is spiritual. This is a spiritual solution. There were to be no dues or fees. Our expenses was to be met by our own voluntary contributions, tradition 7. There was to be the least possible organization, even in our service centers. Our public relation policy was to be based upon attraction rather than promotion, tradition 11. It was decided that all members ought to be anonymous at the level of press, radio, TV, and films. And in no circumstances should we give endorsements, make alliances, or enter public controversy. We see traditions 10 and 6 there. So this was the substance of AA's 12 traditions, which are stated in full on page 561 of this book. So don't take my word for it. Look at that on page 561 of this book whenever you have a chance, because it's stated in full on that page. Though none of the principles had the force of rules or laws, they've become so widely accepted by 1950 that they were confirmed by our first international conference held at Cleveland. Very important sentence for me in the big book right here. Today, the remarkable unity of AA is one, key word right there, one of the greatest assets that our society has. Now, when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, when I came to the fellowship of other fellowships, I would hear such things as, just go to meetings and you'll be okay. Make 90 meetings in 90 days. Everything will be just fine. And you never recover until you die. And in your case, it may be a few days after you die. I mean, all this stuff that I would hear. But as I studied the book, and I love the unity, I love the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, Sexaholics Anonymous. I love the unity of that. But it tells me right there, that's only one of the great assets that our society has. There's 2 more. And without those 2, that one right there usually doesn't hold weight. That's why we see a lot of people come in and out, in and out, in and out. I hear people say it all the time. I've been in and out of the program for years. I don't believe that. I know thousands of people that have been in and out of the fellowship for years. I know very few that have been in and out of the program for years. Big difference. So while the internal difficulties of our adolescence period were being ironed out, public acceptance of AA grew by leaps and bounds. For this, there were 2 principal reasons. If there were 2 principal reasons, we want to look very closely at what those are. Now, I used to just read through this. It didn't mean anything to me. But as I look closely at this, let's look at the first principal reason. The large number of recovery and reunited homes. That's the best reason I can think of. I tell my guys all the time, if you're not doing recovery at home, you're not doing recovery, because that's where recovery is. And page 20 makes that very clear in this book. These made their impressions everywhere of alcoholics who came to AA and really tried. I need to put a question mark there, because is that what I did when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, Sexaholics Anonymous, Narcotics, any fellowship? Did I really try? Look at what happened. And you have to remember that the fellowship and the program was exactly the same in these days. There was no difference. It wasn't until later on, until other things began to come into the fellowship and water down the message that's outlined in the book of Alcoholics Anonymous, that the fellowship began to grow and the big book began to take a back seat. And more and more and more. Most of the people that I sponsor today have been in the fellowship for a long, long time, who are seeking a new experience because emotions have just beat them up. That's where I was at 2019 when I came back. But look at what happened. Those that came in and really tried, 50% got sober at once. 50%. Now, I don't know about where you live, but where I live, that number's not even close. 50% of the people that come through our fellowship today, do you see them getting sober at once, remaining that way? I don't. 25% sobered up after some relapses. That's a pretty good number. I know a lot of people that go through relapses. I don't see 25% of them sober up after that. You know, the remainder who stayed on with AA showed improvement. So I don't claim to be a math genius by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm pretty sure that that's about 75% of the people that come in ended up recovering. That's a good number. So other thousands came to a few AA meetings at first, decided they didn't want, keyword right here, the program. I hear that a lot, my program, a program. But when I started working the program, things began to change for me. Great numbers of these, about 2 or 3, began to return as time passed. That was the first reason outlined. Another reason, number 2, it said 2 principal reasons. Up there was 1, here's the other. It was the wide acceptance of AA, the administration of friends in medicine, religion, and the press. Charlie always told me, you always got to remember, David, these people are our friends. Because whenever it comes to religion, sometimes I've gotten very ugly, not only in my drunkenness, but being sober as well. I don't have that outlook today at all. They are my friends in medicine, religion, and the press, together with innumerable others who became our able and persistent advocates. Without such support, AA could have made only the slowest progress. Some of the recommendations of AA, early medical and religious, keywords right here again, friends, will be found further on in the book. Alcoholics Anonymous is not a religious organization. Thank God for that. I would have never been able to stay here had that been the case. There's no way. I had tried that in many other arenas. It never worked. Neither does AA take any particular medical point of view, though we cooperate widely with the men of medicine as well as the men of religion. Alcohol, drugs, sex, gambling, no matter what it is a respecter of no persons. I think that's absolutely accurate even to this day. We're in an accurate cross-section of American distant lands by the same democratic evening up process that's now going on by personal religious affiliation. We include Catholics. I sponsor a lot of Catholics. Protestants. I sponsor a lot of Protestants. Jews. I sponsor a lot of Jews. Hindus. Same thing. A sprinkling of Muslims, Buddhists. I sponsor Buddhists. More than 15% of us are women. I sponsor some women. This message is for everyone. It's not just for a few. Now, that wasn't the message I was getting in certain places that I was going looking for recovery. They were telling me there was only one way to the Creator, and if I didn't take that path, that I was doomed forever. I couldn't accept that. I see now that I don't have to. I've had an experience here. So at present, our membership is pyramiding at the rate of about 20% a year so far upon the total problem of several million actual and potential alcoholics in the world. We've made only a scratch. In all probability, we shall never be able to touch more than a fair fraction of the alcohol problem, keywords, in all its ramifications. But upon therapy for the alcoholic itself, we surely have no monopoly. We've already looked at that. Yet it is our great hope that all that who has yet found no answer may begin to find one. Look at these words in the pages of this book, keyword, this book, the pages of the book. I promise you, if you stay here to the end of this, many people on here that have been here before can already attest recovery will definitely change. You will see the book in a way that you've never seen the book before, not because I'm the one presenting it, but because it will be broken down so simple there's no way to miss it. And that's what Charlie did for me. That's what other men have done for me through the years. And this has become a beautiful way to look at the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous and to apply the program of recovery into my life. Now I can come back to the fellowship and carry a message that I could never carry before, because whatever that was, I don't know. It has no room for me now at all. So begin to find one in the pages of this book and will presently join us on a high road to a new freedom. Beautiful, beautiful. Well, I've got a few minutes left. I'd like to just cover the forward to the 3rd edition. We'll call it quits for the evening. So grateful you guys have come and listened to me. You could have been anywhere tonight, but you come here, so thank you. Forward to the 3rd edition. Let's look at what's happened all these years later at this point. 1976, this edition went to the printer, this 3rd edition. This is the book that I sobered up on. Many people that are on this meeting tonight that have been here for a long time, this is the one we sobered up on. The membership of Alcoholics Anonymous was conservatively estimated at more than 1 million, with almost 28,000 groups meeting in over 90 countries. Surveys of groups in the U.S. and Canada indicate that AA is reaching out. The question here is, am I? Now that I have this message, am I reaching out to others to try to give it away? Not only to more and more people, it says, but to a wider and wider range. Women now make up more than a fourth of the membership. Among our newer members, the proportion is nearly 1/3. 7% of AA surveyed are less than 30 years of age. We see that all the time in our fellowship now. Among them, many in their teens. The basic principles of AA, which the AA program, it appears holds good for individuals with many different lifestyles, just as the program, keyword the, not my, not a, the program has brought recovery to those of many different nationalities. Man, I have stories by the dozens I could tell about that right there. But it says the 12 steps that summarize the program may be called Los Dos Pesos in one country. We know exactly what country that is. Lace Ducey tapes in another. But here's the key right here. They trace exactly the same path of recovery that was blazed by the earliest members of Alcoholics Anonymous. Why? Because that part of the book will never change. The only part of the book that has ever changed, never will change, is the stories in the back of the book. In spite of the great increase in the size and the span of this fellowship, at its core, it remains simple and personal. Each day, somewhere in the world, recovery begins. Keyword right there. Begin each day, not for the rest of my life, not what happened to me all these 20-something years now. No, each day that begins when one alcoholic talks with another, sharing experience, strength, and hope. Now, I thought my recovery began whenever I got up, got on my knees and said a prayer and did all these things. That's true. That's very good for my spiritual life, my inner life. I have to have that. But look very closely at that. Recovery begins when one alcoholic talks with another, sharing experience, strength, and hope. I need you more than I've ever needed you now. And I hope that you need me. And together we can walk this path and we can recover from a hopeless state of mind. Each day, that begins when we talk with one another to share experience, strength, and hope. The message is outlined in the big book, Alcoholics Anonymous. So with that, I'm going to close. I know my time has come to an end, but I really want to thank everybody involved with this meeting. Thank you so much for coming out, and I'm just really glad to be here.
This concludes David's share on tonight's chapter, but we encourage you to keep listening as he answers questions from the audience and shares additional experience, strength, and hope.
I have a question where you said on XIX at the bottom that today the remarkable unity of AA is one of the greatest assets, and then you said there are two more. Can you tell me? I mean, I have an idea what they are for me, but I just want to know what the two more are, please.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Sandy. Thank you for being here. Service and recovery. You know, the triangle is, the unity is there on the left side, recovery at the bottom, service on the right. And in fact, with most people I take through the book, that triangle in the circle is really a guide to see where I'm at in my life. As I look at the unity on the left side, recovery on the bottom, service on the right, one of the things whenever I find myself going through an emotional turmoil, as I used to do a lot, I can look at that and ask myself, where am I at with the unity? How many meetings am I making a week? Are they healthy meetings? Are they open meetings? Are they closed meetings? Are they big book studies? What kind of meetings am I going to, and how many? Where am I at with recovery? Am I practicing steps 10 and 11 as they're outlined in the book on a daily basis? Has anyone showed me how to do that yet? And if I'm not doing that, then I'm probably struggling in some areas of recovery where the part of unity stays strong. Or I've seen guys that will really start waking up through this book, and they'll start slacking away from meetings. And so the unity seems to go. Whenever we have all three of these areas in sync with each other, unity, recovery, and service, working with others, practicing recovery as it's outlined in the book, going to meetings, that circle represents wholeness. And I tell you, that's been a very, very beautiful thing. So anytime I find myself out of whack, it doesn't take me very long just to go over to that and take a look at it and say, okay, I see now I'm slacking up here. I've slacked off some here. I'm still strong over there, but, a one-legged stool will fall. It just will. So Thank you so much for your question.
Asking around, I've seen people arrive. You touched on it earlier about there's some people believe there's one way to creator, and you mentioned that you couldn't accept that. And I've heard you talk about this before about beginning with the 10th step, but I've seen different ways of going about that. Including in the Big Books That Study Fellowship. I saw a lot of people vehemently oppose that. Can you explain have you seen the benefits of starting with the 10th step as opposed to just going from first step all to the 12th step, and why that was something that you were the first person I've seen that introduced that to me at least?
Yeah, absolutely, Joseph. It's good to hear you, brother. Glad that you joined in. You know, if you read the history of Alcoholics Anonymous and some of the other books that were written, AA Comes of Age, Pass It On, Dr. Bob, The Good Old Timers, books like that, you'll see where self-examination, prayer, and meditation is always what they started with. Well, we know that today to be steps 10 and 11. And I'm okay if people doesn't accept that. But when I sponsor a man, that's exactly where we start. Why? Because if I'm not watching thoughts and emotions, if I don't know how to do that, and what ends up happening is these thoughts begin to overtake me, and I start acting on them. And the next thing you know, I'm in all kinds of trouble again. So, it's very clear on page 84 that we continue to watch. It says, we done this as we cleaned up the past. Well, we know today that cleaning up the past is the first 9 steps as outlined in the book, Alcoholics Anonymous. It would only make sense for me to start with 10, begin to self-examine myself each day. There's only 5 things on that page it's asking me to do on a daily basis. Step 11, the same way. It calls for a nightly review, and the way that we do that has been very effective. Over the past 3 years, I've probably worked with dozens and dozens and dozens of sexaholics and alcoholics. And I've found that to be very successful in the way that we do that. Because as they work through those first 9 steps, it's not something we do in 10 days. I know a lot of people do that, and that's okay if that works for you. That didn't work for some of us. We need something much deeper. So as we work through those first 9 steps, they have something to hold on to, which is step 10, to watch those thoughts as they arise, to check those in the way it says to do, ask God at once to remove them, discuss them with someone immediately, make amends quickly. Notice how it says immediately, quickly, at once. I mean, those words are jumping at me off that page. That's something I better be paying attention to, because in my case, if I don't, those things come and get me pretty quick. But the key to all of that is it says that we turn our thoughts to someone we can help. And as I do that, and I continue to read through this book until we get to the place where we begin to take action with the steps, we've now seen more than 30 people begin to recover. And if other people don't agree with that, that's okay. I'm all right with that. But I know in the lineage that we have here, that's something we're not getting away from, because that worked in the early days of Alcoholics Anonymous, and that continues to work to this day. So I'm very grateful for that question, and it's good to see you, Joseph. Thank you.
I was wondering if you were taken back through the book in 2019, because I know you were early on, so with Charlie, and if so, what was the difference?
Thank you so much for that question. That is the best question that I could ever be asked by anybody. And yes, absolutely, I was taken back through this work, and it started in 2018. I hit an emotional bottom, ended up in a whole lot of trouble with lust and sexual acting out in the fellowship in 2019. I was in the middle of this work, and it was a life-changing experience. It really was. What was different? Charlie was a great man, but he was one of the best men that I have ever known and probably ever will. He was a great mentor. He taught me so much about the book and how to break it down and how to look at it, what it said, and how to understand it. When I went back through it in 2019 with Mike M. from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, Mike took me through the book in such a way that I had to look at it in the first person, which was me. And everything that we did through there were exercises, and we agnostics, I didn't even know it was there. I'd been given book studies based on the way Charlie had showed me for years and never knew those exercises. And we agnostics was in the book. In fact, we will most definitely be looking at them in this study, most definitely. The third step work, oh my God, where we really begin to see how self has blinded us, how it has been our director. We have taken actions based on self that later put us in a position to be hurt. We start to see that self and us is something different. The book says we have made decisions based on self. We see that we and self, that is different. Slowly, we start to break away from that. Inventory was another place. Oh, my gosh. Inventory was huge. There was so much that I'd missed there. No longer was I just checking boxes or I was drawing charts and writing names and doing all this. I was taking a thorough examination of the big book, exactly like it said to make a list. I'd never made an entire list like that. There was a lot of prayer work attached. The third column, there's people on this call that can tell you here tonight, the third column work is absolutely life-changing because it forces us to dig into those emotions that underlie the problems that show up on the surface. And when that begins to happen, we know exactly what we're taking to steps 6 and 7. Fears. I learned that fear wasn't about fear. It was about self-reliance. I learned that sexual conduct wasn't about sex. It was about conduct. There's so much that I missed. And so for the last 3 years in the studies that I've done with these, that's exactly the way I go through the book. In the front of the book and a lot of the places, do I still talk about the things that Charlie taught me? Absolutely. Of course, I always will. But when we come to those action steps in the book and other things that I've learned, I will most definitely be going with what I learned 3 years ago because that is the key. I mean, it's life-changing. There's people on this call that have been in recovery for a lot of years that have went through this process of the book with me and have had an experience. I mean, it's beautiful the way it's laid out. So there were a lot of things that I had missed through the years, and I'll be pointing that out as we go along. So thank you so much for that question. I really hope that you continue to come back each week.